Hey folks, I hope everyone is keeping well and safe as possible during this pandemic time. I send all my best good health wishes to each of you and your loved ones. Firstly, in terms of this event, I'd like to thank Reginald Campbell, the director of the short documentary Tolerance, which we're about to watch together, for allowing us the copyright to screen his work. Reginald Campbell is an Emmy award-winning Jamaican filmmaker currently residing in New York City. His further work and more information can be accessed through this link, which is just going to go in the chat just now. I'd like to thank the co-convening team for this conference for facilitating the event, and to each member of the team themselves for all their thought and effort throughout the process. This event is hosted by myself and fellow postgraduate researcher who you'll see here, Holly King, due to our research specialisms which both surround queerness and postcolonial studies. I'll just do a little introduction of Holly. I don't know which way I'm looking. Is she that way? Is she that way? Holly King, whose pronouns are she, her, is a postgraduate researcher at Nottingham Trent University, focusing sections of queer and intersex studies. Holly is currently studying for her MRes in English Literary Research at NTU under the provisional dissertation title I'm Both, or alternatively I'm Neither, investigating the metamorphosis of the intersex body in literature. That's hi Holly. Hi, Holly. My name's Tom Lockwood-Moran. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. And my current PhD thesis research explores modes of literary and social belonging that resist the lawful oppression of queer people in the Anglophone Caribbean, so that's the English-speaking Caribbean, through contemporary literature, including the works of Marlon James, Marlon Hopkinson, Kai Miller, Dion Brand, Shani Mutu, and Thomas Glave. A critical approach is important for contemporary Caribbean fiction, particularly, as we'll soon see, through Tolerance, due to the region's historical exceptionalness. In the Caribbean, as with multiple post-colonial nation states, the colonial past continues to shape the current regulation of sexualities. Following the screening, me and Holly would like to invite you to join us either within the Teams chat, of which there'll be a link. There's a link at the bottom, or in the YouTube commenting function to discuss the importance of the key themes of this documentary in relation to the broad field of postcolonial studies and kind of more generally, however you'd like to engage with it really. In particular, perhaps keep in mind for discussion afterwards, whose voice remains the most amplified within postcolonial studies in a general sense? Does this support familiar patterns of colonial marginalisation and scapegoating? Thank you all for joining us, and please enjoy the screening, and I'll pop in just after the screening to kind of direct you a little bit, and I look forward to our engagement together afterwards. Enjoy.
The motion challenging the constitutionality of the Buggery Law began in the Supreme Court today, but was put off until October amidst a fresh development. 7 church groups have been allowed to intervene by making submissions on the case brought against the government by US-based advocacy group AIDS Free World on behalf of Javed Jagai.
No government has the authority to rebel against God's higher authority by making lawful what God says is unlawful. God says that homosexuality and lesbianism is unlawful and unnatural. Romans chapter 1 verses 26 through 27.
We are not unidimensional people, and we do not have singular objectives. What purpose would liberation for gay Jamaicans serve if we still have to live in a stagnant society that cannot promise a successful future for Jamaican children? So we are not individuals who are simply seeking, legitimization for our identities. It's my interest in this case, my interest in advocacy fits into a broader narrative of defending and fighting for the rights of marginalized groups in Jamaica. Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, we saw a dramatic shift in the way Jamaicans talked about homosexuality, right? All of a sudden, things were a little more personal, a little more aggressive, a little more violent. And so for people like myself who grew up in Jamaica, that is the only Jamaica I knew, right? And my understanding was that if I came out as gay in Jamaica, I would be killed. And I felt that was always the case because it's Jamaican culture and people always talk about Jamaican culture as if it's something that's static. And then it's through conversations with Jamaicans and through conversations with my parents that I've come to recognize that we've gone through a shift from what some might say is a more tolerant position, and I think we're very much fully capable of getting there again, where we can acknowledge, identify, and not feel like we need to expel the gender non-conforming people in our communities.
At what point did you know you were gay?
It was always there. It was always in their faces. I guess I found out a bit late. I was suppressing the feelings, but it was always there. Bold, bright.
So, and they weren't so happy?
No, they were very unappreciative of the fact that I was different. And so I was very appreciative of myself as well. So when it became a reality, when it became known, it was like, they want that from a child, and I was kind of in a confused state as well. But all in all, I'm happy they know, because 10 years from now, I don't want to be the one DL, down low or in the closet.
But I get exposed to it when I when I migrated in Kingston 12 years ago. The actual behavior became norm, you know, where it's questionable now. Just to my community and to my family, whether or not they're going to be comfortable with it or it's something that I can cope with.
What took place after you participated in the We Are Jamaican campaign?
So I participated in that event early in this year. It was a choice. I wanted to do it, not considering what will be what happened after. It's just that I wanted to do it. It's just a great idea to put my face on TV. So I decided to just go and do it, and I do it. So I went away. I went to Trinidad for a few days and came back. When I came back, it was like erosion, hurricane, where my lifestyle was all over the place, especially my family, where I can't express myself in that way, where I just couldn't take control. So the only control I had to do was to make a decision, was to move. And that's why I'm here for a month now. Even though I may be scared when I go on the road, very shaken, but I think I have no other choice more than just to keep my eyes quiet and just pray to God that everything work out.
In my situation, coming from a religious dad, and living in that environment, and then of course coming from a Jamaican background, you really at that point understood what it means to be gay, and you understood that what it means to be gay is that it's wrong. That it's just, you don't even go into the details of what's wrong. You just know that it was just told that it was wrong. And so at that point, you start to go through, in my situation, the guilt and the struggle of dealing with this wrong and how to deal with the wrong, because there's no instruction manuals. You just one day realized that you were just different, and you didn't know why you were different. You just knew you were different, and you knew that your different was seen as being wrong.
Police had to be called on today to rescue 2 alleged homosexuals from an irate crowd which claimed the men were engaging in an illegal activity in a house in Central Village, St. Catherine. As Damon Phillips tells us, prior to the police's arrival, one of the accused men was attacked by other occupants of the very house he was staying.
Crowds gathered, among them a baby in hand and a pregnant woman. All eyes were fixed on this house where 2 alleged homosexuals were seeking cover from an increasingly angry crowd. The cops had their hands full as the crowds pressed.
We need the fish to come out of the house because the police them can't save him. You understand? We're not in our cabinet.
Officers knew that controlling the situation was critical in protecting the lives of the gay men inside. One of the two men had been visiting from St. Thomas. Here, police are able to rescue him. But neither residents nor the police were going anywhere as the other gay man was holed up inside the house. The Central Village Big Lane residents lamented that this is placing their community in a bad light and claim children will be sent the wrong message about their sexuality.
It's a hard time now, man, for go look work, you see what I say? And the government now set no work for it, but we still not sell out to soul. And we say woman to man, straight.
We can't have them to continue to just spread all these nastiness over the whole country. We got to do something about that.
They're sick. They need to change. Because I don't see how a man can go with a man. They're just sick.
I do business, and if them come around, I'm not gonna run them. Definitely not, because they are human beings still.
I would kill my son if my gay. Even my daughter, I would kill her. No gays.
A group of self-proclaimed homosexuals was on Tuesday evicted from an abandoned house in the upscale Millsboro community in St. Andrew. Several of the men said they took up residence at the abandoned house after they were booted from their communities because of their sexual orientation. And they say they would be killed if they returned. But the police say the men have been wreaking havoc in Kingston, committing criminal and other activities. At the time of the eviction, the men were preparing a meal in the unsanitary, foul place they call home. They beseeched the police for a chance to remain on the premises for a while longer and sought to distance themselves from the perpetrators of crimes who also stayed at the house. But their pleas were ignored, and with that, they left the house one by one. One day later, on Wednesday, the abandoned house was demolished.
Obviously, they can't go home. Where they go now? Where do they go? I can't tell you where they go. They go to prostitution. They join this lottery scam thing. Or they may just come back and kill a few people in the same neighborhood and rob them. So we don't stop to think about the implications of our actions, because we love to think that I'm separate, I'm over here, you're over there, I have this, you have nothing, yada yada yada, the whole separation spiel. Not understanding that my actions have a deep implication of how you live.
Very hard. It's like going to war and you have to be like the survival of the fittest. As you know, we can't go back home, like we're right here so we come from, because the people then find out so we are homosexual and they want to kill with it and so we have to get on the road at the time. We find certain areas that we know we can, as them would call it, like squat on the people their property. We're up at Jazzers, like daytime we walk up on the road, it's a threat, we have to think what will happen if man ever do things that way. So we have to like get one person who look man enough who can go up on the road. Most of the time we don't have nobody to go, so we ourselves have to go. We have to look out our eyes, this and that, our judgment take up on the road and them something, they run up and down, we have to go to police station. We don't have no contact, no link out and say, yeah, things that we would have.
And when I look at these young men, I see people who are so beautiful in their defiance that they are showing the rest of us. They're showing the rest of us how to be ourselves, how to be proud of ourselves even when you are faced with violent opposition. For me, that's inspiring. And I've always felt that way since I first met them.
These young men are a product of their society. They've been pushed out by their families, even if they've had familial support, pushed out by their communities, pushed out by their society, made to be felt that they're less than. And this is just a response in them trying to claim space, claim identity. They may not be doing it in an appropriate way, but they're doing it the only way they know how. And so the behavior that you see is the behavior that you'd see in the inner city. That said, I mean, that should not mean that we do not provide them with any service. It means that they're really just screaming for help. And that is the way we should respond.
Here are the places where people can be put to death for being openly gay. All of the countries are in Africa and in the Middle East, as you see there, but it's also tough for gay people in much of the Caribbean, where they can be locked up for up to 14 years. They are also the victims of hate crimes, attacked by people in their own communities, even from their own families.
The perception that is out there that Jamaica is overtly anti-gay needs to change in the international community, because Jamaica is not a society that is that. It's a society that is against homosexuality. But you being against homosexuality don't mean you're homophobic. In much the same way as me, as an heterosexual man, tolerant towards gay, but my tolerance in no way means that I'm accepting towards a gay lifestyle, but you're tolerant towards them because they're your own brothers that live in your own country.
Well, there's actually no law called the Buggery Law. There is a statute called the Offences Against the Person Act, which is a Victorian statute dating from 1864, which basically covers all of the offences involving violence against the person, from murder through to assault and so on. The offence of buggery is punishable on conviction by a term of imprisonment not exceeding 10 years. So the upper limit is 10 years, and the court may, in fact, impose a lesser sentence, or indeed other forms of punishment are permissible under other statutes, I believe, as well, in appropriate cases, in the discretion of the court.
No one should be discriminated against because of their sexual orientation. Government should provide the protection. And I think that we should have a look at the Buggery Law, and that members of Parliament should be given the opportunity to vote with their conscience on consultation with their constituents.
This government wants to change the law that forbids homosexual acts. To make matters worse, a homosexual activist is suing this government on Tuesday of this week to try to get the Supreme Court to declare the Anti-Buggery Act unconstitutional. If they succeed, judging from what has happened in other countries where the anti-buggery law has been abolished, they are not going to be content at that. They are going to go back to the court to make it a criminal offense to speak against the homosexual lifestyle.
The case that is in the court right now is not asking the court to strike down the law. Currently, there is no provision in the Sexual Offences Act to criminalize anal rape or non-consensual anal intimacy. So therefore, the Buggery Law does serve a useful purpose. What we are asking for is for a declaration from the court to say that when this law is interpreted, it is interpreted to exclude consensual intimacy between adults in private.
After returning to Jamaica last summer to work in LGBT rights advocacy, I was evicted from my home along with my housemates. And I was evicted under the premise that as a gay man, or as gay men, we were likely to engage in illegal acts on the premises. And so the landlord would rather we leave than continue violating the laws of Jamaica, I suppose. But after that incident, I acknowledged the fact that that's actually a very common thing for many gay Jamaican people, which I suppose is why we put so much thought and effort into finding a new home, because it has to be in the right area, you have to have the right neighbors, you have to have the right amount of security. So for those of us who don't have the resources to live in communities that are sheltered from homophobic violence, it's very common for people to be evicted once their sexualities become known. And so I was very much aware of that injustice and of how common it was. And I spoke to a lawyer and asked whether or not the landlord's actions were legal or reasonable. And when I asked him if it was possible to challenge this law in the courts, he said, well, you could, but there's no reasonable chance of success, because the fact is that Jamaican lawyers, Jamaican judges, Jamaican institutions have normalized discrimination against LGBT people. Jamaican institutions have accepted this reality and are not trying to reform themselves to be more inclusive of LGBT people or to recognize the needs of LGBT people.
I was at one point homeless. I was at one point on the streets. And I grew up with certain values, and you'd not see me on the road exchanging sex for money. But that particular night, I was walking and I met him. And from then on, it was like I wasn't willing to share what I was going through with anyone, but he encouraged it. And I can remember when he was there, I gave him all that was going on, and he was like, oh my God, I'm so tired, I don't know what to do. That was his reaction. He was figuring out in his mind, how is he going to assist me? I guess he saw much more than a homeless young man. He saw someone with a past and who wanted a future.
Right now, actually, I'm going to be lying to you, but I think I'm in the process. Because of my whole safety, I think I want to do it because I will have more choice and freedom to express myself in the way I want to. And maybe, who knows what the future may bring. I may be able to help somebody who I knew was in a situation that I wasn't needing help. And I expressed myself. My friend who was staying with me is my daughter, and I adopted him while staying here. So doing that, I think it would be a plus for me and others.
If we were honest with ourselves, we would acknowledge that this country is failing in some very serious ways. And how we treat LGBT people is just one example of how Jamaica is failing. When LGBT people leave, yes, maybe homophobia is the impetus for them leaving. But let's not fool ourselves. They are also leaving for better social and economic opportunities that they perhaps grew up knowing that they wanted and deserved.
When they're in Jamaica, it feels like you're on a path and you just don't know where you're going. It's like you're on this path, but it's just a complete fog. You have no sense or no idea, no consideration of where you're actually going. While outside of that, when you live in America, you can quickly understand that I go to school, graduate, For some people, find a spouse, have kids, settle down, decent job, retire with your pension, and you know, send the kids to college and continue the cycle all over again.
A lot of work in Jamaica. A lot of work.
We love you.
We need consciousness all over the world. South Africa, Jamaica, the entire continent, and certainly here in the United States.
My friends just moved here from Jamaica, so I'm basically supporting them in working with immigration equality. I've been here for 13 years, so it's kind of like I don't go to Pride all the time, but it's their first experience, so I want to, you know, be a part of their fun and enjoyment. You know, as a fellow Jamaican, it's really a challenging atmosphere to be openly gay, and even not to be openly gay, but just to try to be who you are. We're not treated as human beings, we're treated as disposables.
Hi, my name is Kalia Caress Stewart. I'm Jamaican, I'm age 30. I came here 3 years ago on an asylum with immigration equality, and from there on I seek asylum. And the reason why I came to America was because of freedom, and I wanted to be myself because I was a gay man, but now I transitioned into a female transgender, and it has been really a depressing road in Jamaica being gay.
Gay is not a choice. Gay people don't have any choice. It's not a choice. Most of us were born this way. Well, we were born this way. It's just not a choice that you just get up and say, I decide to be gay today, I decide to be gay tomorrow. It's not a choice.
I may be a homosexual, but that does not define who I am. And until people can understand that being gay is a minor part of your life, it's like being a male, being a female, you know? But outside of all this fun and the glitz and the double, like behind me is the mirror, it's two faces. Right now I'm in nursing school, finishing up my second degree. And yes, LGBT individuals, we are not all about the lifestyle that you guys think we are. We're normal human beings. We are lawyers, we are doctors, we work in the healthcare profession. And I choose to go into the healthcare profession on the simple fact that back in Jamaica, we are treated as disposables. So even though it's a different culture and a different environment, I want to be a part of a system that provide care without stereotype and discrimination. And that's what I'm doing now.
What does it mean to you to be a gay Jamaican?
I think to be a gay Jamaican is to be a revolutionary. Someone who recognizes injustice, recognizes limitations, arbitrary limitations that constrain freedom of expression, that constrain liberty, that constrain your humanity. And like other revolutionaries before us, now more than ever, I think gay Jamaicans are choosing to fight against, to reject the cultural order that says in order to be respected as Jamaican, you need to deny your sexuality, right? You need to create these multiple personae that you use to navigate different spaces. And in order to be seen as a respectable Jamaican, you need to necessarily achieve, and you need to become your best self in spite of your homosexuality and by denying your homosexuality. And I think more of us now are saying, actually, no, that's not okay. And I'm going to stand up and challenge that so that I can live the life that I believe I deserve to live.
moving on to the discussion over now. If you wanted to join, there's a Teams link below that you can join, or if you want to put comments in the chat, that's okay too. That'll come through. There'll just be like a 3-minute break with the thing on the screen, so you can organise before we start discussion. Welcome back, everyone. So I think we can agree tolerance is a really powerful depiction of the realities for Caribbean persons who live outside the status quo of straight society, as it were. I'd also like to highlight the bravery and strength of those involved in the documentary and the hopefulness at its climax. Those seeking refugee status often do so through the Caribbean Equality Project organisation, which is based in New York. Their fundraising link will be available in the chat now. For anybody watching this anytime, that'll all stay there. Any donations can contribute directly towards the safety and well-being of LGBTQ plus Caribbean persons and will be really appreciated by the organisation. Although worldwide many queer people experience untold levels of trauma, their ability not only to survive but to thrive is miraculous. Queer people, and most especially queer people of colour, embody a resistant magic that Reginald Campbell's film really brings to the forefront, I think. So relatedly to Forefront, just to start off discussion, we've got Holly here, we've got Nicole, we've got Amy, and if there's any questions that will come through. I wondered if I could open it up surrounding queerness, gender, sexuality, postcolonial studies, with a few open questions related to amplifying the voices of those who aren't straight in postcolonial nations. And by straight, I don't just mean heterosexual or cisgender people, and cisgender means people whose gender expression agrees with their assignment at birth. Straightness refers more to those who don't challenge these ideas in any way, that their embodiment as heterosexual or cisgender is the natural and the correct, kind of the right way to be, against anything else. Especially as much as the scapegoating of queerness is direct as a colonial import, which didn't exist in indigenous cultures. Often indigenous cultures pre-colonization had completely different constructs of what any of the idea of gender and sexuality is. Arguably applying the terms gender and sexuality to non-white spaces can be seen as problematic. But why is it that postcolonial studies, especially in the global north, seem so averse to focusing on that isn't necessarily straight? Why do we not interpret more kind of from the beginning or from the center of postcolonial studies? Why don't we see more of Chris Whitney and Dane Lewis's stories, their reflections in postcolonial nations, beyond? What barriers do you think might shield those or these factors? If there aren't any questions coming through, I mean, I can talk on it more so. Yeah, I guess when we're thinking about postcolonial studies, we're often thinking about who is marginalized within those groups. So we might be thinking about women's rights within postcolonial rights, seminal idea postcolonialism, which take the subaltern or the most disenfranchised colonial subject to be the female in the third world. But why isn't the subaltern queer? Why isn't that something we began with? Why isn't that something that people feel comfortable bringing in? Nicole or Amy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. No, I've just been looking at our curriculum, and you're absolutely right. You know, I think sometimes we're looking for the right texts, almost, you know, the texts that we can kind of interweave, because often in our modules there are so many othernesses that we bring in, and sometimes it feels like we're overwhelming the students in a classroom. But that is no excuse. I think you're absolutely right. It should become absolutely standard. Looking at queer post-colonial narratives in a classroom. I think the additional problems or challenges that I see is that there are ways of talking about, you know, homosexuality and queerness in the West. And we see that now, and just watching Tolerance, you know, it's such a wonderful film, and I absolutely love it. But you can just see discussing that in a classroom, you know, how quickly, you know, this could become an othering exercise yet again. Or look at them, you know, they still haven't caught up. And then there are just so many challenges that sometimes I think we, as postcolonial scholars in a classroom, we made us chicken out of having to negotiate all of those things, you know, simultaneously. But
it feels like, doesn't it? I suppose it feels like it has to be, in order to be given kind of nuance, that it needs, maybe it fits more within kind of, I suppose this is the struggle that there always is between the two fields of postcolonial studies and queer studies. As postcolonial studies scholars perhaps are feeling that fear of doing that, and then queer scholars studies are going through what is ostensibly a canon of queer theory to wherever we're up to without looking at those nations. I don't know. How do you feel about that, Amy? What did you think about Tolerance, Amy? Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I think
it's fine.
I apologise for how I look. I've had a rough week, and I think I've broadcast live on YouTube. So hello, everybody.
Oh, you look good. I like it. I like the sleeves. Really nice.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, of course. Yeah, just to kind of go off what you were asking then, Tom, and Nicole's comments as well. I think there's also a bit of a sea change occurring now as well, where, and I know people bring Holly into this as well. I'm thinking about kind of reclaiming narratives, and from like a post-colonial sense, I think particularly thinking about Indigenous writers, and particularly young Indigenous writers like NDN writers from particularly North America, or you know what is now classed as North America, and the ways in which they are very vocal in reframing queerness as something that is very old, is very old, and kind of goes before colonialism. And I think something like your own project is really, your own PhD project is really important, because I think it interrogates that assumption that Nicole flagged up, which can be that interrogating a lot of homosexuality laws, comes across as, like I said, like Nicole was saying, othering, or kind of having that kind of backwards conversation. But actually, like the work that you've done and others are doing in different regional contexts as well shows how those laws were introduced as, just again, often by the British, as ways of controlling. It happened in India as well, as ways of controlling the populace, and the fact that they were laws that weren't repealed because it's serving a purpose, isn't it? It's serving a purpose where it's stopping those societies either progressing or even just kind of going back and kind of reclaiming something that was already there. I was thinking, I've been marking a lot of exams on Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe at the moment, and there is a sense where that often that novel is viewed as kind of as like an historical document, but actually it's still subject to kind of patriarchal concerns. It's still written after colonialism and after that somebody like Achebe was educated in a Christian missionary context. So it's not going to be able to cover some more of the kind of complexities of kind of like Nigerian life, for example. But also thinking about what Holly's working on at the moment, which isn't necessarily explicitly post-colonial, like in its theory and its subject matter, but I think similarly to what's going on with kind of Indigenous writers in the sense of kind of interrogating what are seen as kind of like historical narratives, but actually are quite new. This colonialism. A lot of these laws, particularly thinking about India and kind of the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular, they're Victorian. It's not that long ago. And similarly, I kind of, Holly, what you're looking at intersex narratives and the ways in which, particularly a lot of younger individuals who identify and are open about being intersex now. The ways in which they actually it's constructed. These ideas are. The idea about hermaphrodite, what Holly interrogates, it comes from Ovid. It's some very European classical tradition, but there's a particular writer who Holly's looking at, and I know others are looking at the moment, where they really sort of problematize. That's the point. Like, is it a trans narrative? Is it an intersex narrative? And actually, it's something much older and linked to Igbo cosmology in that way.
Yeah, that was it. Me and Holly was discussing that even yesterday. We were kind of being ready for this kind of conference chat. Was the idea of when things go back to metamorphosis in Ovid, that of course that these tales from the African continent are often so much older and wiser and longer that they were probably informing these stories anyway, and that so everything kind of leads back to colonialism, but pre-colonialism, and suppose taking that out of the equation. I've found really interesting throughout this whole conference has been the Indigenous focus, which I think is really exciting, especially in terms of thinking pre and subverting colonialism in a lot of ways, and thinking about it in an Indigenous context, but also that the Indigenous context needs to be told from that perspective, from Indigenous people. Same as here. I mean, here I am as a literary scholar talking about this film, which is really spelling out a lot of the issues that keep coming up in queer Caribbean narratives and queer Caribbean writers' lives. This kind of merging of biography and myth, but this biomythography. So what you're seeing is kind of, which is Audre Lorde's concept, obviously, but is what you're seeing is kind of these people's lives, even though it's a literary lens. And that when thinking through the term queer, the fact that people often now either kind of umbrella categorize it as this idea of just LGBT, QI, everything, or that it's got theory on the end, that it's inherently academic and needs to be thought through in that way, when really it's a felt and kind of ineffable aspect of being, I suppose, as the gentleman was talking about towards the end of tolerance, I suppose it's really at its core, it's humanity without the constructs that society's placing upon you, which are particularly strict in the Caribbean and Jamaican region because of post-colonialism and nation building. I think it's really interesting, that part where they show with the news program where there's a crowd of people who are trying to get the gay men kind of out of their neighborhood, and the gentleman who's having the interview there is saying that, like, our nation might be falling apart, but I'm not this, at least I'm not this. And I think by not centering those at the bottom of disenfranchisement to begin with, we're just almost doing trickle-down politics or trickle-down economics, but from a theoretical lens. Because if you're centering post-colonialism on queer post-colonial narratives and queer post-colonial persons to begin with, then it helps everybody. But if you're beginning with cisgender heterosexuality as the norm or as the ideal, that it never really reaches that other. It doesn't reach down. It doesn't trickle down. And I wonder if anybody had any kind of thoughts, ideas on that. Holly, please feel. I'm going to introduce Holly, and Holly's going to talk a bit more on her kind of her research speciality, looking at intersex and how that, obviously, with tolerance, as kind of paradigm shifting in some ways that it is in terms of what we're thinking about when we think about Jamaica. We are also seeing a lot of cisgender men or cross-dressing or transgender women. And is that all that queerness is about? No. So I suppose it's looking at that other lens. But if anybody else has any other comments kind of around, do you think post-colonialism and queerness in the academy, do they have a place together? I mean, personally, through my research, I think they always should have been. So to the point that kind of there should have been a queer location of culture as much as there should have been like a post-colonial epistemology of the closet right at the beginning. And those seminal texts should have already been doing that. And that's the issue. But I don't know what anybody else thinks.
No, I totally agree. You know, and it's right. You know, we often have this own things. Let's start with this, and then we add that, and then we add that, and then we add that, and then we do the queer post-colonial at the very end, you know, of a module. Or and I think you're quite right. We should kind of turn this all around, and I think the time is ripe for doing that. You know, and
it feels it, doesn't it? There feels like there's a shift in what people expect, also. Absolutely,
but it's also, I think, the ease with which people cannot talk about, you know, that there is a language to talk about homosexuality, queerness, that our students are probably a lot more, you know,
cognizant of,
you know, and they can do that much more easily than I think what we could do 10 years ago. But I think it's also, you know, the older guard of post-colonial scholars like me, we just need to learn that vocabulary as well. You know, sometimes I just feel like I'm doing everything wrong. You know, when I try my best and I feel like I keep failing.
That's good. That's such a great part. That's the great part of queer studies. Failure is the perfect bit.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, and it never will. And I suppose this is the difficult part, isn't it? That there's constantly, you're going to feel that failure. Nothing's perfect, but it's the attempt, and it's like the struggle that the queer Caribbean people are kind of going through within that film. It's keeping going and understanding that, like, any bit, your comfort as us, as white people sitting in a room wherever we are, comes at a price always. And so us chipping away at those bits of comfort is what should be happening in every household. But
absolutely. Yeah. But, you know, and as I said, I always kind of sort of scan the horizon for texts that I love to discuss, and then you think, oh, they're too long and this is too complicated. And when, for example, Sarah Newport's excellent work on third gender narratives in India, for example, you know, by the time you unpack all the kind of narratives that come from Hinduism and Islam surrounding, you know, sort of eunuchs and so on, you know, hijras, you know, it would take, you know, it's taken almost, you know, it just takes a long time to get to a really nuanced understanding. But I think You just need to start earlier. You just start in year one.
Yeah. I know that's the most important thing, isn't it, about decolonizing curriculum? I suppose. Sorry, Amy, what were you going to say?
No, just saying. Well, it's speaking to the curriculum. Actually, I mean, this is one of the things that in postcolonial studies, there's debate about whether it did actually come from literary studies, but for argument's sake, let's just kind of go with that version of the story for now. But I think one of the issues has been, and I think I agree with Nicole. I think it's like 10 years ago. I mean, when I started teaching, trying to teach feminism was, teeth pulling exercise, or basically just getting through, a bunch of kind of white middle class girls saying, well, I'm not a feminist because I don't hate men, and and I can't believe the change in like 10, and this is not a university like Trent, I'll point out, and the change from the change in 10 years has been extraordinary. I think Nicole was saying, but I also think something shifted as well within the discipline that I think will hopefully have an impact on the way we teach as well. And also, I think one of the big problems that I've found with kind of post-colonial literary studies in particular, and I'm sure film studies has this, and art studies is a similar thing when it comes to kind of post-colonial material, is the thematic impulse. This idea about, so wanting to read for theme, and that's when things start to get shoehorned in. Whereas I think, thinking about, what you're doing and also what Holly's doing, it's thinking about how the post-colonial and queer kind of approaches to literary text is actually more entwined than people realise, because it's really just turning things upside down. It's just kind of turning what we think, like this idea about, again, because texts help us to kind of navigate away from that narrative of Jamaica being, sort of socially backward in terms of, like that idea about, like that actually if we teach like Nicole Dennis Ben, how do we get around the fact, or something like, Mr. Loverman, Bernardine Evaristo's text, how do we get around the fact that, a student, possibly not through any fault of their own, but because of the way we might be presenting it without realising, or the fact that we're being boring and they're not really listening, and then it comes across as being like being stuck in the past. Whereas I think like the queer narratives and kind of queer texts are normally quite experimental. And there has been a shift in post-colonial studies again now about going back and actually thinking about form, which I know for those of you who are like kind of academic who are watching, that sounds really dry, but actually there's loads of really exciting stuff. And something that I know Holly will talk about is this idea about, when you actually even talk about how does literary studies affect real world change? Well, one of those things is to kind of look at, say, like scientific discourses from the 19th century, and to be like, actually, this is extremely effed up, and the fact is that we say, it's not to say that science isn't real, not to get into that whole thing right now, but it is the sense of it's still a narrative, it's still a discourse, it still has all these things feeding into it. And post-colonial studies and queer theory have had that in common for a really long time. It's just that they've never, I think there hasn't really been an opportunity to kind of bring them together so coherently that we have now, because you have got a lot of younger experimental writers who are kind of doing interesting things without sort of being like, this is an issue-led text, No,
this is just expression. This is my life, or this is how I'm seeing my life from a perspective, rather than a bit like what Jennifer was talking about. I was thinking a lot about. I think a lot about what Jennifer Bukumbi and Zizi Dangaremba were talking about. But Jennifer's, has always long said about, I'm not, I'm not changing what I'm writing just to suit. If you don't follow it, you don't follow it. If you follow it, great. And then it's so much forward.
Queer writers do now,
100%, and it's looking to those places actually for forward. When we're thinking about queerness and resistance, especially, these are the places where that's the forefront constantly, and actually that's the forward. And anywhere in the global north is, because of the constructed nature and that kind of straight line that's saying there's only one norm. That's the backwardness that we're having to kind of unlearn. And in the context of Jamaica specifically, I suppose it's a lot surrounding religion as well, which Holly's going to touch on, in terms of, in Jamaica's, the evangelical intolerance especially, you can see that the evangelical Christian majority is kind of keeping ideas of heterosexism, so just a gender binary and just heterosexuality being normal, as the only thing, and the general society back that, as you could see through kind of talking to people in the streets. So just changing laws isn't going to change attitudes, and actually that can be really a dangerous narrative coming from the global north. David Cameron famously tried to do it in 2011, where he was trying to put a trade embargo on Jamaica in order to off the books. But what happens when the laws, when that happens, is there's a major spike in violence against queer people. So it's a really nuanced kind of backdrop that can't ever just be thought of as backwardness and forwardness. In fact,
yeah, exactly.
And
yeah.
And I'm gonna, for time and everything else, and it is time for Holly. So I'm just gonna jump in and refocus the conversation towards my co-contributor here, Holly King, and say thanks very much for all your help during all this time. It's been great working with you over the past few months. Holly's primed with her own research, and we're going to interrogate through that way. So take it away, Holly.
Hello. Sorry, get comfy. So my research calls attention on a lesser addressed focus within the broad context of queer bodies, and that is intersex bodies and an intersex being, and I read that through literature. I question if that these bodies already do not fit into falsely accepted conceptions of a strict gender binary. How can they be ensured central attention? And that's a necessity in order to attend the needs of all queer persons, not just those who are privileged to be of cis binary. So what exactly is intersex? Interact advocates for intersex youth, and they define intersex as an umbrella term for the differences in sex traits or reproductive anatomy. Further, people are born with these differences or develop them at a young age. Differences include genital, hormonal, internal anatomy, and chromosomal. It is not simply half man and half woman, as Ovid would have you believe. Interact uses legal and other strategies to advocate for children with such differences. Despite the lack of critical attention paid to intersex persons by queer theory, intersex bodies are not rare. Statistically, you're as likely to be born with a form of an intersex variation as you are to be born a redhead. In terms of intersex variations, I mean anything which isn't conventionally understood as either a penis or a vagina, which is then surgically altered to fit within a range of cis-heteronormality. Approximately 1.7% of the world's population are born intersex, whilst 1 to 2% are natural gingers, and 3% of all births are twins. However, this figure only includes those with ambiguous genitalia. It does not include other forms of subtler sex variations, such as androgen sensitivity syndrome, which do not present themselves until puberty. I further suspect that this number is higher due to the births not declared or new birth certificates written after intervention as a direct result of stigma which continues to surround intersex. The medical world emphasises the rigid enforcement of hetero-binary, that sex is based on that kind of sex which doth prevail in accordance to the westernised canon imposed by the church. Although tolerance focuses on important rights for marginalised groups, there remains a fundamental issue and calls for queer rights, which continually suggests an exclusivity. Reflecting on a wider trend within societies of the global north and emergent post-colonial nations, when gay is mentioned, it's automatically assumed that gay cisgender... I've lost my train, sorry.
You've got it, gay cisgender people, yeah.
No, when gay is mentioned, it's automatically assumed that we mean gay cisgender men, not gay women, not gay intersex people, not gay transgender persons, not gay friends of non-binary being. The aim of society is often understood as to produce people who are fertile to marry and to be perfectly fine, and it is society's need for conformity and uphold binaries. My points to raise for discussion are: how can queer be thought differently in any given post-colonial context against conformity and subverting binaries? In order to move away from any centralisation of gay cisgender men, how can queer representation in post-colonial contexts serve to amplify the voices of these even further marginalised groups?
Yeah, loads of really interesting points in there. I don't know if anybody has any jump-ins to begin with, Nicole or Amy.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in, I mean, I'm going to jump in, but actually kind of bring Nicole in, actually, because I was just thinking, I think one of the really interesting things with intersex and this idea of kind of undeclared, but it's also the sense of when we go back in history as well, and even just sort of kind of widening the scope. So that idea of third sex in India, so Hijras and Sarah Newport's work that Nicole referred to as well. It's not exactly intersex as we know it, but I think it also shows that there's kind of like a more fluid sense there, because your question there, Holly, about in what ways does kind of queer and intersex relate. And I think it's that sort of sense of fluidity, because even though to be intersex is a more physical and literally embodied experience, I think there's still quite a lot of, I think something that I know you talk about quite a lot, Holly, is the fact that it often makes kind of medical professionals and kind of cisgendered people very uncomfortable. The idea that actually a body isn't necessarily binary, and we can see that this is becoming more normal, more sort of a normal discourse now. I think that people are understanding around kind of like how bodies vary, and how genitalia varies as well. But yeah, it's something I kind of wanted to bring in more with Nicole, because I think there's something, particularly in India, I think there's some kind of really interesting and exciting work around that, which doesn't necessarily fit into post-colonial or queer in many ways, which I think also might sort of show where a kind of intersex and other ways of thinking about a gendered body can start to be more expansive, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are all these other non-Western traditions, that are just not so hung up on these binaries. And often these binaries, this love of the binary was rooted, with colonialism and this sense of wanting to create order, where there is just messiness, right? And I think Europeans, wherever they went, saw messiness that needed somehow correcting. And it's absolutely so. There is just a really, I think in postcolonial studies, there is a real need to kind of undo a lot of this, these rigid structures, that are put in place. But of course, they are in place everywhere, aren't they? They're still in place anywhere. And I mean, often in those colonial scenarios, they often seem to be more rigidly in place. And then there is again this narrative of lag that is created that then needs to, of course, also be problematized. So it's a really interesting idea, isn't it? That in some ways we just need to maybe just rethink entirely the way we teach any text in post-colonial studies, right? And any sense of kind of normativity.
Yeah,
I think that's actually really exciting, and I think we should really start embracing that. But of course, it also needs a lot of nuanced knowledge, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to romanticize. Maybe some kind of, oh, look at that. This is how. A statue of this god, half male and half female. Oh, how lovely! Yeah, but you just need a lot of knowledge to kind of actually understand how that is situated. Yeah. In the class system and caste system, and regionally, and so on. So it's I think you need to know a specific context in order to be able to teach and speak about it, very knowledgeably.
And this is the problem, isn't it? Because a lot of these disciplines, and when I was listening into the roundtable, and I sort of remember, and I'd forgotten that I had made a reference to this as well. But I mean, I kind of stand by it, and it's true. It's the ways in which knowledge is segregated out as well. So the fact is that you can have like an American literature module, you can have an introduction to literary studies, but then you have to have a gender and sexuality model, or or a post-colonial model. And often, I remember, you and me talking about this, Holly, as well. That the fact is, often it seems like you're sort of having a choice between the two, because like if you're particularly interested in something and the other thing can't actually offer that, but actually, it's like this is what I'm always kind of a bit skeptical about thematic kind of groupings of things, and for me, I think that post-colonial does include all that, like gender and sexuality, does and can include more things around thinking about, race and different ways of thinking. But something that I found, I think, is an interesting connection between, I think, kind of particularly intersex activism and I think post-colonial kind of thought and study more widely is the ways in which I think, thinking about that film as well, thinking about tolerance and the ways in which that is a sense of, I can accept someone, but I don't have to appreciate their lifestyle. And there's still this very individualized idea about, that the person an individual comes out. I mean, that's quite an old-fashioned, becoming increasingly old-fashioned. The fact that it is, it's not a choice. You are born this way. And I think it's interesting thinking how intersex activism is kind of has managed to kind of follow that train as well, because I think what happens is that the ways in which a lot of scholars and politicians and even like legal people are uncomfortable about talking about these old laws and having to kind of untangle them, so therefore it's like homosexuality isn't a criminal offence, so we must do something about it. But actually something like intersex activism really flags up the sense of, well, some things are a choice, but it isn't the person. It is, the person who's being born doesn't have the choice to choose. That autonomy is taken away from them as a child. And I think because obviously more of that conversation, if I'm right, Holly, most of that conversation is happening in the global north and in like predominantly sort of white European context or Anglo-American context. I think it makes people very uncomfortable to realise that those kinds of habits have been able to make decisions on behalf of someone who's, because a baby is perceived not to have autonomy, even though, children's rights are enshrined in law across kind of all sorts of white contexts. I mean, like, the idea about the rights of the child. But there's something about this idea of, well, we need to choose. So we're going to choose to have like, genital modification, or even if we don't do the genital modification, we're going to, raise the baby in a particular way until we can tell them and they can decide, like it's some kind of, again, so I think there's something about that I think raises a lot of really uncomfortable questions that I think the global north perhaps isn't as forward thinking as it thinks it is, because actually it's still stuck in those binarized ideas, but also ideas about what, who knows best. I'm not saying a baby can make a choice, because I mean a baby's not going to have like the capabilities of understanding, about gender, and binary. But I think there's something that I don't know if you want to talk about, is Holly, but like even some of that, the more sort of the European and American writers that you look at, particularly like contemporary, like actual intersex individuals, I think a lot of what they say makes people really uncomfortable, doesn't it? Because it is this sense of you took away any choice that I could have had.
Yeah. I mean, I read, obviously, one of my books that I'm looking at for my dissertation is an autobiography written by someone who is actually intersex. However, because their father was a surgeon, he sort of only saw the cosmetic purposes of altering her genitals, and it's like, now there's no point. Like, why would we do that? I mean, they're quite, from the sounds of it, the parents are quite sort of strict and conforming anyway, but it was the fact that they made the decision not to make them sort of conform at such a young age when they didn't have any say. And morally, it's quite a grey area. I mean, how can a child consent to something which is completely life-changing? It's like, it can, let's say they have let's say they have both a uterus and testicles, or a little bit of each. Therefore, their hormones are going to be completely different to what's considered normal, which means they're going to have hormone therapy for the rest of their life. If the doctor decides, right, you have a girl, and then but their clitoris is a bit too long, then they'll operate to make it a sort of normal size. It's a loss of feeling. Like, that would be such an awful life. Like, never being able to feel pleasure, or and by doing all this, it sort of generates and continues like the shame and the stigma that was already surrounding intersex variations. And it just boggles me how people can still do it and think, oh yeah, it's fine, just so that a guy can have a stand-up wee. Like,
yeah. I think merging like yours and Amy's points on those with the kind of born this way and intersex variation as absolutely the norm, I think, but not being kind of societally constructed as the other in order to enforce this binary. Postcolonial studies, I think, can offer almost an unknown variant in that way in order to begin some forms of looking at queerness that have intersex and anything that isn't cisgender homosexuality. Because I mean, cisgender homosexuality, it doesn't need the time and effort that everything else. It's become this black hole that sucks everything in. I think it really offers an opportunity. And I think one of the main issues with both queerness and postcolonial studies that make them in tandem once we get to higher education, kind of rife for bringing together, is pretty much everybody comes with a blank slate, because your national pedagogy in Britain, at least, is not teaching you about postcolonialism, is not teaching you about our own colonialism, and is not teaching you about queerness. And actually that can, if we were to then begin at the beginning of undergrad by bringing that in, I think there's a real want for it now in a way that there wasn't before, because people are beginning to, instead of coming through from school, and I know I was a mature student myself, so it's not always the narrative, but if you take the majority kind of coming through school, and then it used to be that it would just almost be like higher education was just the next 3 years that you did of school, whereas now people are coming in and they're learning, oh, this is where I'm going to get taught the stuff that I wasn't being taught at school, so give me that. And I think that's a really exciting part for both of areas that perhaps white British society specifically, don't want to have in the spotlight, is to kind of have those in the spotlight straight away. Really offers an opportunity with both the disciplines if they were being brought together to begin with, rather than thematically later on. Like, you're going to work through postcolonialism and you're going to come up to queerness, or you're going to work through queerness and you're going to come up to postcolonialism. Yeah,
you're right. They're in tandem. They're like, they're parallel tracks. I don't think there's any. I think I look back now, and it's funny you mentioned about David Cameron. And I thought, well, because he was one of the MPs. I think he was one of the youngest MPs to vote for Section 28. And I'm very much a product of Section 28, being in place. And I think there's something. There's no kind. I don't think there's any accident that I think I gravitated towards, say, kind of like postcolonial material, postcolonial research and material. I think when I sort of felt very othered, like all through not my childhood necessarily, where I think it was pretty flexible, but as an adolescent, like, in high school, and the area that I grew up in, the school that I went, the peers that I had, where it was just thinking anything different, whether that was appearance, disability, race, like, just would be squat. It would be crushed. It was just sort of seen as something that is not right. And I think that for a long time I thought, oh, why did I, kind of like, is it actually sort of like weird white savior complex about gravitating towards this stuff? And even though I don't feel that impulse at all, but I think like it's only been in recent years, just like, oh, I see now actually a bit more, because I think there is more of an intersection between kind of queer thinking and postcolonial material, world literature, whatever you want to call it. This made me think, no, there's a reason. It's because it's this way of untangling other people's narratives and other regions and other nationalities, narratives, and the ways in which those individuals have rewritten those narratives as well. Sort of helps you to kind of unpack your own. And I think, and this isn't like any criticism of anyone who's like kind of like cisgendered, and sort of comfortably heterosexual. It's just that I think sometimes you don't have the experience to sort of pick up on that straight away And sometimes, like, don't get me wrong, post-colonial scholars can be terribly self-congratulatory that they can do this. But sometimes I noticed it can be sort of picked up and walked away. It's like, this is what I do professionally, and then it has no bearing. But really, it has no bearing on real life.
So is that empathy? Empathy. It's bringing empathy into the academy, which wouldn't that be amazing? That's your word, empathy.
And we talked a lot about that word, didn't we? You know, that came up quite a bit yesterday. Absolutely, didn't it?
Difficult. We had a question through from Perna. I think it's more directed towards Nicole and Amy, perhaps. Regarding India and the question of hijras, some state governments have recently introduced quotas whereby a certain percentage of government jobs are fixed for non-binary people. As a policy decision, what are your thoughts on it, and are there comparable parallels in other countries in this regard?
Well, I mean, sort of spontaneously, my thought is that sounds really exciting. But again, you know, I mean, as a scholar, we always know that our gut reactions are almost never right. And you can't really say anything until you've done weeks and weeks of research, you know, which makes us in some ways often the most tongue-tied people in the world, I think. But, you know, because I mean, a lot of things that are happening in India, you know, are quite repressive at the moment, you know, so this seems to be going oddly against the grain, but maybe sort of also kind of harking back to a pre-colonial understanding. Yeah, so I'm sort of on the surface, without having really thought about it that much, I find this really, really interesting. And I know that sometimes hijras are also seen as people who are maybe sort of less corruptible because they don't have a family entourage necessarily, because they're often already seen as outsiders in their communities. Yeah, so I mean, this makes us all very, very, and these are very complex discourses. But I don't know of other comparable parallels. And
I was thinking. I was thinking.
Yeah,
I was thinking about what I had for the first time completely discovered, and that the lady from the first panel was talking about the Maori academic, about how New Zealand has quotas now for, so every university has to have Maori, like a Maori studies department with Maori people who are the scholars, and it's kind of, and I suppose similarly in Canada, I think some of the universities have that for their First Nations scholarship. And that's amazing, because as much as we're all here kind of championing post-colonial scholarship in all its problematics and glory in its way, it's because the people that it's amplifying the voices of the people who were in the video, intolerance, I guess, for me, with queer Caribbean people, and the fact that those departments should then be headed by those people, and people should be able to learn from those people in higher education. And I suppose quotas are what would really help that. So to have queer Caribbean people, queer Caribbean writers, academics teaching queer Caribbean text, but it's not there yet. So in order to get that, there needs to be the focus on the literature, which for me is always the best cultural forms in the world, you know, and everybody's going to think about the right thing. But yeah, I think quotas is really interesting, isn't it?
It's interesting though, isn't it, in terms of sexuality? Because I mean, not that for hijras, I mean, there are debates in terms of, you know, narratives surrounding hijras and how they overlap or just parallel with trans narratives. It's really interesting, because those are narratives that come from different sort of historical directions and geographical ones. But it's an interesting idea, you know, in terms of quotas for a third gender.
But I think, you know, it's as long as it's meaningful, isn't it? And I think this is going to be the question about, because I think it's a great question, Perna, and thank you, thank you for asking. And I think we all kind of, it's interesting, it's government as well. And like you were saying, Nicole, I mean, that things about being quite repressive, and also that kind of Hindu nationalist kind of emphasis at the moment. And so there's that kind of like skepticism, but it's also to make it kind of not just specific to India, but thinking kind of about that move, and also elsewhere in the world. It's also making sure those things are meaningful. I mean, I know a lot of universities are having this moment as well, because we referenced it a little bit in, you know, the roundtable panel. and it's come up, and I know it came up in the craft panel. Sorry, I know it came up, yesterday through some of the papers as well about a class, not just a classroom, but actually the university as an institution and what it's kind of supposed to represent as being progressive. So the sense of having to be very careful about towing the line, try and keep governments happy, because obviously the funding comes from that, but also there's still this pressure of making sure that it's what they call EDI, equality, diversity. What's the I always forget now. Is it inclusivity? Equality, diversity, and inclusivity. But it's the pressure that I think not just universities, but I think a lot of big institutions across the world now are starting to feel the pressure of it's not enough to just kind of tick a box anymore. It has to be meaningful. And I think one of the things that has happened is that I think, at least in the UK, I think whereas sexuality is something that I think is broadly kind of accepted, and largely I think through things like marriage equality, but I've always felt very uncomfortable kind of around that anyway, because it's this really strange thing about having to the focus being so much on gay, lesbian, bi. I mean, I'm talking about 10 years ago, it being kind of, well, what is who do I do and don't fancy? What has that got to do with kind of identity? And that was referred to in the film as well. I think what's really interesting now is actually how gender is under scrutiny again. So things like the fact that in the UK non-binary is has not been recognised as a protected as a protected category, or really even a category at all legally. And everything that's going on, particularly targeted with young trans people, and particularly like trans, older trans women, like adult trans women as well. I find it fascinating that I think suddenly gender, where it shouldn't be as threatening as something like sexuality. Sexuality has now become the sort of the comfortable subject of gender, and the idea of being able to it's a threat. And I think in even that sense of people feeling caught out, it's kind of what you remember with women. It's like, oh, you can't say anything now, everything's politically correct, and it feels a bit like that with non-binary, where it's like oh, I don't know how to say, I don't know what to say anymore with pronouns. And actually, it's not someone. I'm not the only one who uses they them pronouns as well. It actually doesn't matter that much. It's like it's really kind of if people make an effort, great. If people don't make an effort, you're being a bit of a dick. You know what I mean? To using your binary term there. But do you know what I mean? It's like it's something that I think is really interesting, because it shouldn't be it's not as scary a sense of something like sexuality, which always seemed very threatening to people, and still does. That's why homophobia
still exists.
Still exists. It's still this idea of the fear of what is seen as a deviant sexuality. But now it's very interesting. It's this kind of misogyny, but also this discomfort around the fact that gender's not fixed. And I think that's where I think intersex activists are having a struggle. People saying it's like intersex and asexuality. Interestingly, people will often say, well, it's only 1% of the population, and it's like, it's only 1% of the population that we know of that's been recorded, like Holly was saying, but we think there might be more. And I was thinking about this in global terms as well. Communities, there's still a lot of communities where births aren't registered in the same way. That there has to be estimated, or the fact that that there isn't the medical opportunities or discourse around to make somebody think, oh, I better put my child on hormone treatment, or change the way they look. It's I think suddenly the fact that really a minority part of the world is now suddenly having to grapple with grey areas and nuance. That's where you get this culture wars thing from. Because suddenly it's like you can't do anything. Black Lives Matter is evil, and trans people are trying to take away my rights.
And I think that's a really important point to bring it back, I think, towards the what we're talking about with the actual, that all of this boils down to there is still a threat there, that it becomes threatening. And actually, especially for the people in tolerances, we were seeing this this threat isn't kind of threat to identity, or this is threat to life. And kind of refocusing that back, that there is, I suppose now we're waking up to the kind of the shifts in gender are what really feels threatening towards a lot of people in a certain bubble that have created a certain fallacy, and everybody's playing into it, and that's okay. But then as soon as anybody's not doing that, the violence that's kind of brought onto these bodies is amazing. So just to highlight again, and then I'll pass over to Nicole to close, because I am time and I'm looking at so just to kind of bring it back again to in the chat, it'll stay, everything on here will stay. So if anybody's watching this in the future, to kind of click on the Caribbean Equality Project and just donate, just give, because it's not about the movement from the Caribbean outside. These people really have a love and generous kind of homeland sense with Jamaica, but for safety, and also during COVID, there's been a lot of people who are kind of homeless and living on the streets, and there's a specific COVID relief funds. So yeah, thinking about kind of what we're talking about here has real life consequences in these regions, and watching the film, you can really see that. So yeah, I just wanted to thank Holly again, and thanks everybody for coming and joining in. It's been really great. And if anybody wants to, in the future, again, if you're watching this at any point, mine and Holly's uni email addresses are going to go into the chat. So if you have any follow-ups, if you want to be in touch for any reason, then please feel free to get in touch. And thanks again, everyone. And I'll pass you over to our conference organizer, Nicole, for her conference closing statement.
It's not really a statement. Don't do that to me.
Yeah, no, conference closing. Adieu. That's the adieu. Adieu.
I just want to thank everybody, because I mean it's just really been quite a journey as we've been learning to organize an online conference, as a conference unlike any that I've ever organized, and I've organized quite a few in my life, and I have loved the sort of the camaraderie of the conference team. Our weekly meetings have just been phenomenal, and I think really our sort of postgrad researchers who are part of this conference organization committee were fantastic. Look at you, Tom and Holly. I mean, this has been such a wonderful closing event, and I know this has been going through quite a few iterations, and it's been really testament to your stamina and will to make it happen that this came about. And I think this is really wonderful. And I also really would like to thank Purna Chandra Naik, who made yesterday's event with the Dalit rapper Sumit Samos happen, because that was really a real highlight. And I listened to the music quite a few times. I don't know, I'm not too old for that. And yeah, it was wonderful. And also, of course, Amy, that was the roundtable event on craft activism and ethics. I listened to that the first time, we recorded it quite a few weeks ago, but it was just, as Thomas said in the comments, real food for thought. It's such an interesting, area that I had actually never really paid that much attention to. And also a very warm thanks to Eve Mackes, Right and Residence, because I think those events with Sevgul Uludag, that was happening on a Thursday, and today's with Mina Bamiye. That was just fascinating, wasn't it? The food activism, culinary activism. I had no idea that existed, and I think that is just such a smart move, especially I think in the context of Palestine. I think that was really fantastic. Yes, everybody, who haven't I mentioned yet? Of course, Jenny, who organised everything with us and was such a brilliant chair of the first panel yesterday. Our panelists, I think, were all amazing. They put so much effort. We asked them to rewrite some things and so on, and they took everything in their stride. And I think they're really just wonderful, and it was absolutely lovely. And of course, the team at the Bonington Gallery, Tom Godfrey and Lockwood-Moran, and Joshua, who has been mentioned so many times, sometimes with other names. Joshua, can you put yourself on the screen? You said you could.
No.
Just a quick wave. Oh, yay! Honestly, I mean, this is sort of Joshua. Nothing would have happened without Josh. He literally had. He was there. He recorded everything, put everything neatly together. He knows how to do Excel sheets. and he's just absolutely in control, the calmest person, most therapeutic person that I ever worked with. And, you know, thanks to you. I mean, you were such a huge part of organizing this conference and just kind of giving it this vibe, you know, where everyone was so comfortable. And when we met yesterday with the panels in the social, people were really complimentary. Everyone felt really well looked after. And this is really largely down to you, Josh. You've been really absolutely wonderful. And that's one more shout out to people who are also kind of want to immortalize on YouTube, because they gave an event, the creative writing workshop, which was of course also on the program, but of course it wasn't streamed live. So that is Manjit Sahuta from Poets Against Racism and Leanne Moden. Thank you so much for organizing this creative writing workshop that just ended 1.5 hours ago. And the title was Poetry and Protest, How Writers Use Words to Change the World. Yeah, and I think this is a nice sort of closing statement, because ultimately this is, you know, something that has come up all the time, don't we? There is a lot of that we want to keep, that we want to change. And I think postcolonial studies has a role to play, but it also has to change a lot itself. Is there anything else that anyone wants to say as a closing statement? No, I think, yeah, I'm never great in terms of profundity at the end, but yeah, thank everybody so much.
No, thank you, Nicole. We need to thank you. Thank you. Thank you for putting it all together and doing it.
You know, this was really, really wonderful. I'm elated, and I loved this entire event. I'm also totally knackered and exhausted, but I think when the camera comes on, I don't know, you get this energy again. Completely deflated. But thank you very much, and yes, I wish all these kind of recordings well in their afterlife on YouTube.
Yeah.
Thank you all for watching whenever you're watching.